Cato the Younger, when we're talking about Seneca, we mean Seneca the Younger. But when we're talking about Cato, is it always usually Cato the Younger, or is
No, I'll actually be covering that in my presentation. We're going to compare Cato the Younger to Cato the Elder, his great-grandfather. So you'll see that's the way they named people back then, was just to be able to tell them apart. Then along sometime in history, they came up with last names. What a concept, last names. All right, well, welcome again, everyone. Today's presentation is on Cato the Younger, and this comes from the book, The Lives of the Stoics. I'm going to be sharing my screen so you can follow along with the education of Cato and the history of Cato. First, Ryan Holiday begins his chapter on Cato the Younger with this paragraph, and I think it really shows you where we're going with the life of this person. Every few generations, or perhaps every few centuries, a man is born with an iron constitution that consists of harder stuff than even his hardiest peers. These are the figures who come to us as myths and legends. Where did that strength come from? Will we ever see a person like that again? Marcus Porcius Cato was one of these men. Even in his own time, it was a common expression, we can't all be Catos. Well, that's no understatement there from what you're about to hear. The life of Cato is really amazing. I'm going to start with the history. Item number one is his name, as someone was just asking, is Cato the Younger. Was his name because we need to keep him separate from Cato the Elder, who was his great-grandfather, and also, interestingly, also a Roman senator. But Cato the Younger was a Roman senator, an orator. He was very much known for his integrity, and he did not take bribes like many other people in the day. He was also known for being very stubborn. And his character, this consistent character that we're going to see, is what really makes the history of what's coming up very important, because at the time, there was a lot of corruption in Roman government. And when Cato believed in philosophy and Stoicism, that was just fundamentally different from the corruption that was going on. Also, his skepticism and his being stubborn happened from a very early age. One of his teachers, Sarpedon, observed this early on, and he said it was very difficult to change Cato's mind. In other words, Cato would not change his mind either for being stubborn about something or maybe being not willing to learn something new. We don't actually know from the history yet, but that's how it was in the early years there. That brings us to item number two. There are two interesting stories of Cato at home and Cato visiting the Roman dictator Sulla. The first story, I think, is really memorable. It's as told by Plutarch. One day, there was a rebellion leader named Marci who visited the home where Cato was living. And he visited the house, he saw Cato and the other siblings there, and he asked the children in a lighthearted tone if they would support him in his rebellion going on at the time. And all the kids said yes, as you can imagine, they nodded their heads, but Cato was silent. And this was supposedly at a time when Cato was only 4 years old. So Marci was pressing Cato for an answer, and amazingly even held him up over a balcony by his feet, and Cato would still not approve. The conclusion to this was that the rebellion leader ended up praising Cato for his behavior. And I think it's basically a case where Cato, the 4-year-old, beat the leader of the rebellion. Then we move on to item number two, Cato visiting Sulla, the dictator. Ryan talks about this interesting part of the history where Cato was a firm believer in justice and liberty. Even as a young child, he would, for example, he would protect younger children from bullies. And then comes this riveting story about Cato visiting the house of the Roman dictator Sulla, and he was still a child, and he asked a question of his teacher, Sarpedon, who happened to be there, he asked his teacher, why were many people paying respects to Sulla? And his teacher explained it's because people feared him. So then Cato supposedly replied, why then didn't you give me a sword so I could free my country from slavery? That's a very pointed response. Sometimes I wonder when Plutarch relives these stories, I wonder if they were embellished a little bit, because that's really an amazing story. Item number 3, how did Cato acquire Stoicism? Well, I think that there are two big teachers in this area that he admired. The authors of the book next talk about how Cato needed a way to control the fire inside, and this is how he came to Antipater of Tyre, who was another Stoic philosopher. Very little is known about him, but Cato supposedly learned from him how to control his emotions better and to control the fire that really was very much a part of his life, but as we all know, with anyone, it can get out of control. Number 2 is, it goes to the other Stoic teacher, let's see. Oh yeah, the part of Cato being interested in oratory. And Cato was very famous for saying once, I begin to speak only when I'm certain that what I'll say isn't better left unsaid. And so this is a great quote that also goes very much with Stoicism 2,000 years later. Today in the modern age, Stoics are very famous for being silent, and it's not because we're being antisocial, it's just because we're thinking up some rational response or some better decision to be made. All right, so item number 4, his time as a soldier and a military tribune. There are 3 big dates here, 72, 68, and 67 BC. I wrote them down because I always get these dates confused. When Cato became a political force, he was widely known for his integrity and not bending to corruption. But this all started back when he became a soldier in 72 BC. He was first volunteering as a soldier then, and he believed that his actions and his sacrifices were very important for others. That was the beginning of his thinking when he volunteered as a soldier. After 4 years of service in 68 BC, he became a military tribune, which means that now he was leading other soldiers. And in part, I think his character helped him rise to this new position. Then 1 year later, in 67 BC, he was given command of a legion in Macedonia. Now, this is another major benchmark for Cato because he was only 28 years old and commanding a legion. That's pretty impressive. I think that here his reputation was furthered because everyone knew how he acted around other soldiers. And specifically what I mean is that he ate and slept with them. He didn't have his own luxury with him as the leader of the legion. So that's really the rise in those years, 72 to 68 to 67. Also, it's notable in 67 that was the year that he heard his brother Scipio was dying, and he tried to get there in time, but he could not arrive in time. His brother died before he could get there. Even though he was very trained in philosophy, he had a very heavy grieving process for his brother. And Plutarch describes this, that even a Stoic person like Cato can grieve because, quote, how much tenderness and affection was mingled with the man's inflexibility and firmness. In other words, we're all human, and grief and connection with people is very much a part of us. And when we lose that, of course, it's a natural process to grieve. As a politician, I'm getting to the end of the story here. By the time that Cato was 30, he had enough military experience and also experiences of loss that he was quite consistent as an individual. He was quite hardened as a personality. And then he was elected to be questor. Now, in this role, he first studied, I find this interesting, he first studied the position of questor and the history of quaestors who had served before him. And not surprisingly, he found a lot of people who were corrupt in government at that time and before him, people who were corrupt under Sulla. He found that the treasury and its practices were very often inappropriate, so he overhauled that. And he even found previous people who had been quaestors and had used funds illegally, so he prosecuted them. That was all a part of the new Cato as politician. And also, as he rose to power, it's important to note that Cato made a lot of enemies. People were hindered by Cato's actions because they were often involved in corruption. They were profiting for themselves. And Cato, here comes Cato, wearing simple clothes, not wearing perfume. He walked barefoot in the streets. He was very gregarious with other people. People just naturally took to him. And so he was very likable in that way. And yet many people in government were not like that and therefore hated Cato. Now there's so much more to say about Cato, but I'm going to try to wrap up here with item number 6. These are the two Stoics that I think affected Cato. First was Aristo. He was a very good example of being a practicing Stoic because he considered everything outside of his control to be indifferent. Everything outside of virtue was indifferent, and Cato took after him in that regard. This is something even today that is very difficult for us to do. How can we ignore all these things outside of our control? How can we ignore the bad things that happen to us? It would be great if we could all choose virtue first and only follow that. But that's one of the reasons why we look up to Cato, is because he was able to do that for most of his life. And number 2, Diogenes. I think that the teachings of Diogenes also affected Cato because this was demonstrated in a way when Cato was sent to annex Cyprus. And unlike other Roman politicians who did annexations of regions of the world, they often sold the treasures that they found there and benefited their own bank account or their own treasury. But here with Cato, when he sold the treasures found in Cyprus in that annexation, it went straight to the Roman treasury and he took nothing for himself. So there were people who are quite surprised at this, even though he was known for his integrity, but other people were again upset at this because they wanted to profit themselves. So again, there's much more to the history of Cato, but you can see from that early story of a 4-year-old being hung upside down, forced to give in to something and him not giving in, from that stubborn child through Cato the soldier and then the politician, we can see how very consistent his life is. And the conclusion that I'd like to leave you with, item number 7, is what Ryan concludes with in the book. The quote is, "Not all Romans could be Catos, but Cato could represent them." Even then, well, then or now, I think it's difficult for us to be a person as consistent as Cato. But just recently on a Friday night at Orlando Stoics, we talked about having a sage on your shoulder. This comes out of Massimo's book, The Handbook for New Stoics. And the idea of having a sage, or if you like, a Cato on your shoulder, is one way that you can examine the experiences that you're having in life. And you can think, how would that sage or how would that Cato respond if he were here now? So I hope that you can use some of this advice, the way that Cato seeked virtue in his life, the way he followed the 4 virtues, the 4 Stoic virtues, of course, wisdom, justice, courage, temperance. And when you're looking for advice in your life, I hope you can use these ideas to improve your life.